There was certainly an element of making my grandfather proud and honouring him by taking part in the award that has been so much of his life's work. And I definitely hope that I have made him proud.
There's a story making the rounds online right now, one that claims Lady Louise Windsor has quietly inherited a cottage on the Balmoral estate, supposedly nicknamed Wren's Nest, and that the gift is somehow tied to Prince William and to her godfather, Lord Ivar Mountbatten. It's a compelling story. It's also, as far as any verifiable source can confirm, unconfirmed, a mix of real family history, dressed up with details that don't appear to trace back to any actual palace statement, land registry filing, or named source. Before we go further, that distinction matters, so let's be upfront about it. Throughout what follows separates what is actually documented about Lady Louise's life from what is circulating as rumor, and it labels each part accordingly. Royal inheritance stories have a particular pull because they sit at the intersection of two things. People are endlessly curious about enormous historic wealth, and the private emotional lives of people the public mostly only sees performing a public role. When a story combines both a beloved matriarch, a quiet granddaughter nobody expected to matter, a hidden property, a family secret, it's almost engineered to travel. That's not a criticism of anyone's curiosity. It's simply worth naming before digging into the details, because it helps explain why a story with this much unverified material has spread so widely and so quickly across multiple channels using nearly identical language and structure, just with different reveals bolted on. So let's do this properly. Separate the parts of Lady Louise's story that are actually documented through interviews, biographies, official statements, and consistent, corroborated reporting from the parts that exist only in speculative, anonymously sourced content. Both categories are interesting. Only one of them is fact. Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor was born on November 8, 2003, at Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey. Her mother, Sophie, then the Countess of Wessex, was rushed to hospital after a placental abruption, a serious complication that caused significant blood loss for both mother and baby. Louise was delivered by emergency cesarean, weighing a little over 4 pounds, and spent time in a neonatal unit as a precaution. Her father, Prince Edward, was on an official visit to Mauritius at the time and wasn't present for the birth. These are documented facts, widely reported at the time and confirmed by the family in later interviews. What happened next shaped the rest of Louise's upbringing. When Edward and Sophie married in 1999, Queen Elizabeth II made an unusual decision. Their children would be styled as the children of an earl rather than as a prince and princess, even though under existing rules Louise and her younger brother James were technically entitled to royal styles. In practice, this meant Louise grew up as Lady Louise Windsor, rather than Princess Louise, a quieter, less scrutinized existence than most of her cousins. That low profile was reportedly deliberate on her parents' part, and it produced one of the more charming anecdotes about her childhood. In a 2016 BBC documentary, Sophie recounted that Louise, as a young girl, didn't realize her grandmother was the queen. She'd come home from school, confused, because classmates insisted her grandma ran the country, when to her, grandma was just grandma. It's a small story, but it's a real one, sourced directly to Sophie's own words rather than to anonymous insiders. Louise was educated at St. George's School in Windsor, and later at St. Mary's School, Ascot, where she studied English, history, politics, and drama at a level. Before starting university, she reportedly spent a summer working at a garden center, the kind of ordinary teenage job that stood in contrast to the more heavily publicized lives of some of her cousins. She's also been photographed doing unglamorous, relatable things, like sitting on the floor of a crowded train working on a laptop because there were no free seats. Royal commentators have repeatedly described her as the most down-to-earth member of the extended family, and that reputation is one of the more consistent threads running through nearly everything written about her, credible or not. Her education followed a fairly conventional path for someone in her position: private day schools, A-levels in subjects that gave no obvious signal of a particular career direction, and eventually, university. What's notable, and what royal watchers tend to return to again and again, is how ordinary the visible parts of her life have been allowed to look. A garden center summer job, public transport, a description from a royal insider as the most down-to-earth member of the family. None of that is dramatic on its own, but it built a public image, grounded, unassuming, uninterested in the spotlight that later stories, including the unverified inheritance rumor, lean on heavily. The rumor works in part because it's consistent with a real reputation Louise has built over 2 decades, even where its specific claims aren't. If there's one part of this story that rests on solid ground, it's Louise's relationship with her grandfather, Prince Philip, built around competitive carriage driving. Philip helped popularize the sport in Britain during the 1970s and continued competing into his 90s. Louise took it up as a child, and the two shared what multiple royal biographers and family friends have described as a genuine long-running bond over the sport, not a manufactured one for publicity, but a real shared hobby that gave a busy, aging royal patriarch and his youngest granddaughter regular low-pressure time together. When Philip died in April 2021 at the age of 99, it was reported, and this part is well corroborated, that his carriage driving equipment, including his fell ponies and the dark green carriage used in his funeral procession, went to Louise. She's continued competing since, reportedly asking to be listed under the family name Mountbatten Windsor rather than her title at competitions, and her trainer has spoken publicly about her dedication and her preference to be treated like any other competitor. At the Platinum Jubilee in 2022, Louise led a carriage procession honoring the centenary of the Fell Pony Society, driving her grandfather's ponies, a moment widely reported to have moved onlookers, including, according to some accounts, the Queen herself. It's also worth noting how unusual it is, even within a family full of horse enthusiasts, for a shared hobby to become quite this central to a grandparent-grandchild relationship. Most royal family bonds that get public attention are built around formal duties, official visits, or milestone events. Philip and Louise's connection was built around something much smaller and more repetitive: showing up to compete, tending to ponies, driving carriages in all weather. That kind of relationship built on shared, unglamorous routine, rather than grand occasions, tends to produce a different, arguably deeper kind of closeness than the kind generated by ceremonial appearances, and biographers who've covered Philip's later years have pointed to his carriage driving hours with Louise as some of the more contented, low-pressure time he spent in his final decade. It's true that royal commentators, including figures like Majesty Magazine's Joe Little, have suggested over the years that Louise held a particularly close relationship with Queen Elizabeth, partly because of her fragile start in life, and partly because of shared time at Balmoral during summer holidays. It's also true that Louise and her brother James reportedly enjoyed time at Balmoral with their grandparents, and some reporting describes Louise helping look after younger cousins like Princess Charlotte during family gatherings. Where the story shifts from documented family dynamic to unverified claim is in the specifics claims about exactly what Elizabeth and Louise discussed during private time at Balmoral in her final years, or precise details of what was supposedly promised or decided about property, are not things any named source has actually confirmed. Royal wills in the UK are sealed by the courts for a minimum of 90 years, specifically to keep the details of who inherited what out of public view. That means, quite simply, nobody outside a very small circle knows the contents of Queen Elizabeth's will, and any specific claim about what Louise did or didn't receive from it is, by definition, speculation, however plausible it might sound. This is the point where a lot of royal content quietly crosses a line with naming explicitly. It's the difference between reporting multiple sources describe a close relationship, which is true and reasonably well supported, and asserting, the Queen decided during private conversations in 2019, 2020, and 2021 that Louise would inherit a specific property, which nobody has actually confirmed, because those conversations, if they happened in the way described, were private, and the only people who'd know their contents haven't spoken publicly about them. A plausible-sounding scene isn't the same thing as a documented one, even when it's built from real ingredients. Here's what's factually true and useful context. Balmoral, along with Sandringham, is one of the few royal residences owned personally by the monarch, rather than held by the Crown estate on behalf of the nation. That distinction matters, because it means the sovereign has more personal latitude over what happens to it, unlike Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, which belong to the state regardless of who sits on the throne. This is a real, well-documented distinction in how the monarchy's property portfolio works, and it's the kind of detail that makes rumors about personal Balmoral bequests sound more plausible than they might otherwise. It's also true that the wider Balmoral estate contains numerous smaller structures beyond the main castle cottages, lodges, and farmhouses scattered across the Highland estate, some of which have historically been used as private retreats for family members. Craiggowan Lodge, for instance, has long served as a family retreat separate from the main castle, and Birkhall in Scotland is well known as a residence associated with King Charles. There is precedent, in other words, for individual family members having access to or association with specific structures on royal estates. What there is no verified precedent for, however, is a named cottage called Wren's Nest being formally bequeathed to Louise as a wedding gift, particularly given that Louise, currently in her final year studying English at the University of St. Andrews, is not, as far as any credible reporting shows, engaged or married. Some gossip coverage has linked her socially to a fellow St. Andrews student, but nothing beyond that has been substantiated, and a wedding gift framing for an unannounced, unconfirmed engagement doesn't hold up as anything more than a narrative device. There's also a practical wrinkle worth mentioning even where a private estate like Balmoral gives the monarch more personal discretion than crown-held properties. Any significant transfer of that kind still tends to involve trusts, estate planning, and often multi-generational arrangements rather than a single, simple handover. Prince William inheriting Tam Nagar on the Balmoral estate from the Queen Mother in 2002 is frequently cited as the closest real precedent for a property passing directly to a grandchild rather than the next generation down, and that example is genuinely documented. But it also shows that these arrangements, when they do happen, tend to surface gradually through the family's own actions and appearances at the property in question, not through a single dramatic reveal, which is another reason to treat sudden, fully formed inheritance stories with some caution. To be fair to the broader logic of the rumor, gifting property around marriages is a genuine royal tradition. Anmer Hall on the Sandringham estate was given to Prince William and Catherine around the time of their wedding. Gatcombe Park was originally purchased for Princess Anne also around her marriage. So the idea that a property might eventually be gifted to Louise upon a future marriage isn't implausible as a general pattern.